Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to PATH, Patient Advocates Transforming Healthcare Tuesday Table Talk. We are now live on YouTube. I'm really excited to welcome our guests today when we delve into the topic of patient-centered measurement. Karen Fraser, PhD, is a senior researcher in the Research and Evaluation Department at the American Institutes for Research. She's also a friend and a colleague. I've been really fortunate to be part of the AIR team on this particular project looking at patient-centered measurement. And Karen's going to tell us a lot more about what that looked like and some more details about it today. But it's really been for me such a valuable journey. When I first became involved in patient family engagement through my own experiences with my family, I never knew what connected us in terms of the measurement piece of healthcare and how that builds in a lot of accountability and a lot of benchmarks and really drives healthcare improvement and healthcare transformation. And so it's really been a privilege to be part of this project and to be part of this larger conversation around looking at measures that really matter to patients, families, caregivers, and communities. And so I'm really excited to have Karen here today. Welcome, Karen, to PATH Tuesday Table Talk. I wanted to also remind our audience that you can always send in your questions in our YouTube chat. So if you are signed into YouTube today, please do share your questions and hopefully we'll be able to get to those during our talk today. So Karen, I just wanted to kind of start and give our audience a little bit of an overview about what is patient-centered measurement and give us a bit of an overview about the project and the work that's been done around patient-centered measurement.
Sure. So patient-centered measurement is healthcare measurement that's driven by patients, families, and communities' expressed preferences, needs, and values. And in healthcare, whatever's being measured is what clinicians, hospitals, and health systems are going to pay closest attention to. So if, for example, what is measured is what's really important to clinicians and payers, then the healthcare that's provided is going to align with what matters to clinicians and payers. But on the other hand, if what is measured is what's really important to patients and families and communities, then the healthcare that's provided is going to align with what is important to patients, families, and communities. And so it's really important to consider exactly who decides how to measure and develops the measures for in healthcare measurement. Because if patients, families, and communities aren't included, then patients, they're not going to receive the kind of care that's guided by what's most important to them. And so my team at American Institutes for Research has really been pushing for measurement to be patient-centered. We developed actually a set of 5 principles for patient-centered measurement. And those principles say that patient-centered measurement is co-created, it's patient-driven, it's holistic, transparent, and comprehensible and timely. And then recently, we just concluded a set of 4 pilot projects that were supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And the purpose of those projects was really to put those principles into practice and understand how they work in the real world. And what we learned was that in order for patient-centered measurement to be, in order for measurement to be patient-centered, you really need to have equal partnerships between researchers and patients, families, and communities in terms of developing and driving what those measures look like. And then also it's really important for those teams, the research teams that include equal partnerships with patients, families, communities, to be flexible in terms of how they're developing their relationships, but also in terms of the work that they're doing towards measurement. But as we reimagine healthcare measurement to be patient-centered, it's also really important that patient-centered measurement is equitable.
Thanks, Karen. That was a really great overview of the principles and what centered measurement is. I think what I also wanted to kind of add for just our audience background that, you know, coming up with those principles was really a collaborative effort. And so a broad multi-stakeholder team was really brought together of all different facets of healthcare, including patients and families, to really assist with creating those principles. And I think that really was a very, for me, a really interesting experience, but also I think very telling that this is really about grounding ourselves in that patient-centeredness and really using that as our North Star. And even at that particular meeting, we had a star, I remember, on one of the walls, and we all wrote, about what our North Star should be. So I think that was a really great moment and really helped drive a lot of the conversations at that particular meeting. So you talked a little bit about, well, a few things. You talked about the pilot teams and the kind of the second phase of this project. And then we also talked about, looking at equitable patient-centered measurement. And so I think, especially now in the midst of our current societal conversation around racial injustice and structural racism and health inequities, and of course, being in the midst of a global pandemic, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what does equitable patient-centered measurement look like, and perhaps maybe even share a few examples, whether related to the pilot teams or from your own experiences with other work in the field.
Sure. So, like you said, COVID-19 has really demonstrated the urgency of addressing health disparities in healthcare. And Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities in this country are suffering disproportionately related to a long history of inequitable treatment. And these include things like structural racism and environmental degradation that have impacted those communities. Think of Louisiana's Cancer Alley or the Flint water crisis. Flint is a city that is over 50% African American, and lead in the water doesn't just affect children, it affects them severely, and disproportionately we see that it's affecting Black children, but it also affects the adults. It causes cardiovascular issues. It can lead to hypertension, high blood pressure, kidney issues, reproductive issues for both men and women. And these are all really high profile examples of kind of the everyday systemic inequities and environmental inequities that communities of color in the United States face. And some of the more mundane, but really severe inequities that these communities face include things like living in food deserts, confronting the chronic stress of racism, having poor access to educational opportunities, and even lack of access to healthcare. Actually, I just read today in the New York Times, there's an op-ed that talks about how payers have put into place different payment models. And the payment models are ostensibly designed to improve quality of care, but they have the consequence for, in many cases, of actually making it more difficult for minority communities to get care because of the kinds of measures that have been put into place that are driving both structural issues, but also human behavior. And those are really serious issues that lead to then health disparities. And so equitable PCM, the goal of equitable PCM really can be a tool to address health disparities, because it means having these voices, the voices that have not been equally represented at the table, the voices of people who are from food deserts, who have experienced chronic racism, who have experienced lack of access to healthcare and safe and effective healthcare, having those people at the table in terms of defining the measures and developing them and saying what is important and what matters to them and what their experiences are. Otherwise, healthcare is going to continue to only serve a segment of the population. And so equitable PCM is really about having a broad diversity of patients, families, and communities that are providing input, providing their voices and partnering, not just providing input, but serving as equal partners to research teams as they develop measures. And I should also say that diversity doesn't just include questions of race. There's all sorts of different kinds of lived experiences that are important and valuable to have as equal partners in this work. So culture, language, age, health status, gender identity, all of those things are important to consider. And for the research team, it's important to think about what the community is, what community is being impacted by the work that they're doing, and having taking a good look at those issues and then bringing those people into the fold.
Thanks, Karen. I think, going back to what you just said, and also before, the who is such an important part of this, right? Who is at the table and whom is making decisions and whom is deciding what measures matter. And so if you could talk to me a little bit about, as someone who works obviously in patient family engagement, I know, very, unfortunately, very clearly, there is such a gap between the voices that are engaged in this work and the voices of many communities who sadly are not engaged in this work. And a lot of explanations, however one wants to frame it, it is made as to why that's the case. But, as you kind of look at patient-centered measurement and even at some of the pilot teams' work, why do you think that this continues to be a challenge, in looking at patient-family engagement, but specifically looking at engaging patients and families as part of research or measurement teams?
Yeah, so patient-centered measurement is, we've been seeing uptake in the last couple of years, but it's a relatively new area of measurement work. But it's also a subset of patient and family engaged research. And so in both patient-centered measurement and patient engaged research, we tend to see that the majority of the partners are white and fairly affluent, middle to upper middle class. And there are a lot of reasons for that. To this point, research has really expected partners to be volunteers. They aren't compensated sufficiently for the work that they're putting in, and if at all. And there's not always a lot done to accommodate their schedules or their ways of working or their ability to travel. Transportation can be an issue. And so that can be a real problem. Also, researchers often invite patients and families to be engaged in this work, and whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, they often invite people that look like themselves, that see the world or have the same life experiences as them, and who don't necessarily challenge their own viewpoints or their perspectives or their vision for the work that they're doing. And so because you have a certain group of people who is initially invited into the work or able to access the work, then it becomes a cycle, and those people get experience, and those are the names and faces that researchers are used to seeing, and the table isn't usually broadened to include other voices and other life experiences.
Thanks, Karen. So, in looking at the four pilot projects, if you could just give our audience a little bit of an overview of those pilot teams and perhaps, share a little bit about them in terms of, how those partnerships look like. We know there was, a pretty wide range of involvement in terms of each patient partner, but if maybe you could share some of that and perhaps I think it would be helpful too as we have continued to have this conversation about encouraging, research, measurement teams, and healthcare in general to really look at equity and really equal partnerships with patients, families, and communities. Perhaps just sharing a little bit about each team as some, real world quote unquote examples, I think would be helpful.
Sure. Yeah, we had four pilot teams. They focused on a variety of different health issues. One was related to maternity care, one was related to dialysis care, one related to cancer care, and then finally traumatic brain injury. And each of the teams was really structured quite differently. In one case, there was a patient partner who had actually brought the idea to a researcher that he had worked with in the past, and they put together the proposal together, and he was a co-PI on the work, and he had an equal share um, in basically everything that pertained to the project, from being involved in the budget and the IRB issues to actually conducting some of the interviews. We had other teams that were structured differently. There was a team that worked with their partners and as kind of almost like a steering committee, and they would meet regularly uh, to discuss their approach or their ideas for how to move the measurement forward. And there were other teams that also had their partners doing interviews, but one of the common denominators across all the teams was that all of the partners were in a relationship of equal power, in the sense that they were co-creating the work. The teams were working together as partners and were really designing the measures and the different care processes that they were working on together. There were, I'm thinking about one of the teams, for example, where they really had some challenges in terms of recruiting different voices. It was something that they were really focused on from the beginning, voices with different lived experiences, and they had to make some accommodations. They had to be sure that they were clearly providing compensation for the people who were participating and who they were partnering with. Also, it was a maternity group. They were talking about maternity issues, and they had to make accommodations to have children in the room, babies in the room, nursing mothers. And so they really had to be really thoughtful and consider how they were going to reach the community that they were trying to, that they wanted to hear from and they wanted to partner with.
Yeah, I think that underlines what you started with, that flexibility component that really needs to be part of this work, whether it's in measurement or research or in healthcare partnering with patients and families. So, I wonder now, as you've kind of had time to reflect on this work and, where we're at in the work and where we could go. If you could look ahead, where do you see patient-centered measurement going in terms of, healthcare transformation, in terms of, looking specifically at research and measurement? But what if you could have if we all could have that, crystal ball and look ahead to see, what could happen, what could this really drive and change in healthcare? What would you what would you say reflecting on the work that's been done thus far and where it could go?
Wow. Well, it makes me think about the idea of community voices leading this kind of work, community voices who know what they need, and really have, for a long time, been either neglected or used in ways that are not to their benefit by researchers. And I mean, really would like to see them with a voice and power in order to be able to work with measurement teams and tell payers what it is that they should be measuring, that they should be holding physicians and hospitals accountable for. Um, and it's going to take, I think, a lot of work on the part of researchers and those inside the system of measurement to reorient themselves and think about what kinds of changes they need to make to the way they work and the way they uh, connect with their partners, or even invite partners at all to make that happen.
Do you envision too that at some point you may have community engagement leaders or patient and family leaders approach researchers and say, we've got the project. We'd like for you to come and partner with us. Do you see that as a possible next phase as well?
Oh, yes, I think that would be wonderful. I mean, it was such an inspiration to see that happen on a smaller scale in our pilots, where this was the brainchild of one of the partners. He had been an advocate for years and understood his community. And he knew, I mean, talking to him, it was really clear that these were questions and issues that he'd been thinking about and wanting to address for a long time. And finally, he had a moment in which he could, he had a voice to take those to a researcher who was culturally competent, who would listen to him and was willing to be flexible and also share power with somebody who had never led a research project before in that way. And I think that it was a great experience for the entire team, and they came out with a really incredible product that is being adopted slowly but surely by dialysis centers in our area. Well, they're in my area, so in our area. So yes, absolutely. I think that that's the dream, right?
Certainly, yeah, yeah. I think that that's certainly the vision and the goal we hope to get to, and I think we will. The more we embrace these principles and really have the supports needed to place them into action. And I just got a comment in our chat is from Ellen Schultz, who's also part of AIR. Thank you, Ellen, for your comment. She says, what I'm hearing is how much the work of recentering healthcare around patients is connected to broader changes across our society to shift power to communities. And I think that's exactly what Karen was touching upon, and I think is really going to be the next phase of what healthcare transformation must be, to certainly address all of the issues we know have existed, but have really been magnified by the current pandemic and obviously the subsequent conversations and incidences of police brutality we've witnessed this year, to really ignite that conversation around racial injustice and structural racism, which is sadly also part of the healthcare system. So, again, reflecting on, what's possible in this work, do you feel that if we truly embrace, patient-centered measurement, can we get to that goal of health equity? Is this really a driver and a tool for change? And if so, if someone today, let's say a researcher or a measure developer is watching our table talk, what advice would you give them on why that why utilizing PCM is a tool and driver to get to that health equity we all seek? And how do you even, should they begin? How do they start? And maybe we'll leave the last few minutes for you to answer that question, Karen.
Sure, absolutely. Health measurement, like I said earlier when we started, measurement, whatever's measured is what's going to be focused on. And if we don't have a continuum of people with the diversity of lived experiences that are informing measurement, driving measurement, helping to develop measures, then what the healthcare system measures is not going to be what's important to those people or essential for those people in order to get the kind of quality, effective, safe care that they need. And so we need a diversity of voices to have healthcare that works for a diversity of people. And so I do believe that healthcare measurement is absolutely a tool to address health disparities. And I think that for researchers, and I'm going to be vulnerable for a second and say that this is new for us too. This is something that we're learning about and still exploring, but I can say that it's really important for measurement teams, funders, researchers to recognize that there's a gap here, that we need measures that are co-created and patient-driven, and also measures that are equitable, that reflect a diversity of voices. And they really need to reflect, especially those voices that have been excluded or neglected to this point. For what research teams or measurement teams should do, I think there's a lot of internal work that would really help get you prepared for what comes next. Part of it is inviting and listening to people who are in communities who you have not invited or listened to before. And that could pose some challenges because it's going to be new for you. And so you'll need to do a lot of work on cultural competency, learning how to build trust and establish relationships with different communities. And that's also going to take time and patience. And with time comes resources. And so it's going to take time and resources to do those things. On a practical level, when you are working with partners, they need to be provided with appropriate compensation for the work that they're doing and for how much they're supporting your team. When they're equal partners, then that should be significant. And also, research teams need to be prepared to meet their partners where they're at. So that can mean literally, like in their offices instead of at the hospital or the clinic or wherever research is happening. But it also means figuratively in terms of what the meetings look like, when the meetings happen, and how you accommodate. One example from one of the pilot teams, for example, is there was a woman of color who was a partner on the team, and she was not comfortable using the video conference and going through the materials by herself. And so someone from the research team would go to her every time they had a video conference meeting, would go through all the materials with her and make sure that she felt comfortable and was ready to be a part of the meeting and able to contribute, as opposed to just letting her kind of flounder on her own. So, and then the teams also need to be flexible. With new voices comes new ideas and new directions for work. And so teams need to be flexible in terms of how they're relating to each other and to their partners, but also in terms of what their work looks like, what direction the measurement work takes, and how the work is actually done. And I also feel like I need to say that funders and leadership really need to set an example here, because it's not possible without funders recognizing this need as well and providing the resources and support that are necessary to compensate partners fairly, to spend the time that it takes to build relationships. And so they need to provide that support. And it can also be helping to guide their team, the research teams, in developing cultural competency, or helping to support the partners in terms of learning about measurement. So the funders and leadership also need to make steps towards making this possible.
Thank you, Karen. Definitely some sage words of wisdom, and I'm sure any of our audience who's out there in terms of researchers and measurement teams, I hope that some of that advice will definitely trickle down. And when we do post our table talk from today, I'll be sure to include the links to some of the work that's already been done in terms of reports and such from AIR, so that people can read a little bit more about patient-centered measurement. Well, unfortunately, we're at our time. I know you and I, Karen, could talk forever about PCM and patient engagement and health, all things healthcare, but it's about that time that we'll have to close our table talk. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us today on another Path Tuesday Table Talk. Please do join us next week, where our topic will be the moral determinants of health. And we will be speaking with Dennis Wagner, a former senior executive at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and also a healthcare consultant. So we look forward to welcoming Dennis to our program next week. Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing all things patient-centered measurement with us today. And thank you for your leadership and your work. And we look forward to hopefully maybe having you on in another few months and seeing where the trajectory has gone in terms of measurement. I'm sure this is ever changing, so I'm sure we can have many more conversations in the future. If you could just hold on for me for the next few seconds, Karen, as we close out our Path stream. And again, thanks so much to our audience for joining us. See you next time on Path Tuesday Table Talk every Tuesday at 2 p.m. on our YouTube channel. Thanks again.